In the bleak winter of 1286, the cold winds over the kingdom of Castile carried whispers of a terrifying truth. Its monarch, once celebrated for his brilliance and strength, was dying in a way no king before him had ever died. Across monasteries, castles, and market squares, rumors spread that the sovereign King Sancho IV of Castile, the ruler who had crushed rebellions, faced down nobles, and fought tirelessly for his throne, was now rotting alive. It was said that the stench of decay filled his private chambers, that his flesh was blackening while his mind remained sharp enough to understand what was happening to him. The horror of it captured the imagination of Europe, for it was a cruel end that no royal lineage, no sacred anointing, no crown could protect against. To understand how Sancho IV, known as Sancho the Brave, reached such a tragic fate, one must step back to the shifting political landscape of late 13th century Castile. This was a realm scarred by warfare, court intrigue, family betrayal, and the lingering tensions of the Reconquista. The stability of the kingdom depended heavily on charismatic and powerful rulers, and Sancho's rise to the throne was anything but peaceful. His father, King Alfonso X, had been a man of immense learning and ambition, earning the nickname the Wise. Alfonso envisioned a Castile strengthened by law, culture, and centralized authority, yet his intellectual pursuits came at a cost. Powerful nobles, religious factions, and rival claimants to the throne resented Alfonso's reforms, his taxation, and his obsession with imperial dreams. Into this atmosphere stepped Sancho, the second son of Alfonso X. Although not the designated heir, his older brother, Ferdinand de la Cerda, was meant to rule. Sancho's destiny changed dramatically when Ferdinand died prematurely. Despite Ferdinand leaving behind two young sons, Sancho, supported by key nobles and military leaders, pushed toward the throne with force and determination. In 1282, amid civil war, familial betrayal, and escalating conflict, Sancho rebelled against his own father. Alfonso never forgave Sancho for seizing the throne before his death, but the momentum had shifted. When Alfonso died in 1284, Sancho claimed the crown, becoming King Sancho IV of Castile. His reign began under a cloud of controversy. Many in Europe believed Sancho was a usurper, robbing Ferdinand's children of their rightful claim. The papacy hesitated to support his rule, and neighboring kingdoms watched Castile's internal divisions with interest. The young sons of Ferdinand de la Cerda found protection in Aragon and France, countries eager to use their claim as political leverage. Meanwhile, within Castile, numerous nobles refused to accept Sancho's legitimacy. For the king, every day was a battle for survival against plots, rebellions, and external threats. Yet Sancho IV proved himself capable. He suppressed noble uprisings, strengthened the monarchy, and fought against Muslim strongholds in southern Iberia. He earned respect on the battlefield and became a symbol of defiance, a king who would rather die fighting than surrender his throne. His marriage to María de Molina, one of the most influential queens in medieval Europe, further stabilized his reign. Intelligent, diplomatic, and politically gifted, Maria became the linchpin of Sancho's rule. She negotiated alliances, managed noble factions, and ensured her husband retained the support of key military leaders. But while the kingdom was slowly stabilizing, the seeds of Sancho's tragedy were already being sown. The relentless stress of war, political pressure, and ruling a fractured realm took a toll on his health. Medieval chroniclers described him as a man who pushed himself beyond human limits, often fighting while ill, traveling during harsh winters, and spending nights in strategy councils rather than resting. Such conditions made him vulnerable to disease, and Europe in the late 13th century was rife with infections that modern medicine would later identify as gangrene, sepsis, or necrotizing illnesses. It was in 1286, only 2 years after he had taken the throne, that the first signs appeared, Sancho developed a painful swelling in his legs, which rapidly worsened. Chroniclers wrote that the flesh darkened, then turned purple, then black. The king endured fevers, chills, and agonizing pain. His physicians, limited by medieval knowledge, applied poultices, herbs, and prayers, but could not stop the progression. Soon, a putrid smell filled the royal chambers, something his attendants were forced to mask with incense and burning oils. Descriptions from royal clerks and monks hint that Sancho may have suffered from gangrenous necrosis, where tissue dies from infection and begins decomposing while the victim is still alive. Despite the debilitating illness, Sancho refused to step back from the throne. He continued issuing commands, meeting nobles, and planning campaigns. Chroniclers noted that he appeared determined to outfight even death, as if stepping down for a single moment would invite rebellion. But the rot did not slow. His legs swelled until they could no longer support his weight. The infection spread upward. Monks reported that worms appeared in the wounds, and that the king had to be isolated to prevent the smell from permeating the palace. Throughout his decline, Queen María de Molina remained at his side. She prayed tirelessly, cared for him directly, and shielded their young children from seeing the horrors unfolding in the king's chambers. Her loyalty during this period cemented her reputation as one of the most devoted queens in medieval history. As the king's condition worsened, the court grew tense. Nobles whispered about succession. Foreign ambassadors sent reports back to their kings. The sons of Ferdinand de la Cerda, still living under the protection of foreign courts, watched events with interest, knowing that Sancho's death could reopen the question of who truly had the right to rule Castile. By early 1289, Sancho could barely speak. His once commanding voice had weakened, and his body had wasted away. Yet even then, he tried to preserve stability. He issued final instructions to Maria, and insisted that their son, the future Ferdinand Roman IV, be recognized as heir. But with Ferdinand only a young child, the kingdom's future rested heavily on Maria's ability to navigate the treacherous political landscape. King Sancho Roman IV died later that year, consumed by the infection that had ravaged him. Chroniclers recount that even after his death, the body continued to decompose rapidly, confirming that the disease had penetrated deep into his tissues. His death sent shockwaves across Iberia. Rival claimants immediately sought to challenge the succession. Foreign kingdoms considered the weak position of Castile an opportunity, and within Castile itself, nobles began preparing for the battles and political maneuvering that would follow. But Sancho's story did not end with his death. The consequences of his illness, his rule, and the succession crisis played a major role in shaping the next century of Iberian history. His son's reign, supported entirely by María de Molina, became a prolonged struggle to keep the kingdom from fracturing. The legacy of the king who rotted alive lived on, not only as a tale of physical suffering, but as a reminder of how fragile medieval kingship truly was. When King Sancho Roman IV ascended the throne in 1284, Castile was far from a unified and loyal kingdom. It was instead a realm stitched together by fragile alliances, ancient grudges, and unresolved claims born from decades of dynastic quarrels. While the death that awaited him years later would shock Europe, the deeper tragedy of his reign began much earlier, rooted in the political betrayals and miscalculations that shaped his ascent. His slow, agonizing illness was merely the final chapter of a life defined by turbulence, suspicion, and relentless struggle. The foundation of this instability lay in the succession crisis that erupted after the death of Sancho's older brother, Ferdinand de la Cerda, in 1275. Ferdinand, the rightful heir, left behind two young sons. According to traditional inheritance laws, the crown should have passed through Ferdinand to his eldest son, Alfonso de la Cerda. However, Sancho, already an ambitious prince, saw this as an opportunity. Backed by powerful nobles who resented Alfonso X's policies, he argued that a child king would plunge Castile into chaos and expose it to foreign threats. In a time when kingdoms were constantly at war, many found his reasoning persuasive. Yet claiming the throne came at great cost. For years, the kingdom fractured into competing loyalties. Those who supported Sancho and those who believed Ferdinand's sons had been robbed. Sancho's decision to seize the crown, although politically effective, created bitter enemies not only within Castile but across Europe. Aragon, France, and the papacy all watched with unease, seeing Sancho as a king stained by rebellion against his own father and by usurpation of his brother's children. Sancho's early reign was therefore dominated by conflict. Noble families, especially those tied to the de la Cerda bloodline, conspired against him. Foreign powers offered refuge to his rivals, keeping alive the constant threat of invasion. Inside the kingdom, assassinations, ambushes, and political blackmail became tools of everyday governance. At the heart of these struggles was Queen María de Molina, a woman whose influence would shape Spain long after Sancho's death. Maria's marriage to Sancho had been controversial from the start. The Church questioned its legitimacy due to distant relation, making their children's royal status uncertain. Yet Maria stood beside her husband with a loyalty that bordered on devotion. She negotiated with rebellious nobles, calmed the Church's concerns, and won over key military leaders. Without her, Sancho's reign might have collapsed before it began. However, the constant stress of holding the kingdom together gnawed at the king. Sancho was a man who viewed strength as the essence of kingship. He rode at the front of armies, marched across deserts during military campaigns, and confronted his enemies face to face. Chroniclers describe him as intense, driven, and relentless, traits admired in war but dangerous in matters of health. His refusal to rest or show vulnerability weakened his body long before disease ever reached him. The turning point in Sancho's reign came with the uprising of several powerful nobles who sought to place the young Alfonso de la Cerda on the throne. Supported by King James Roman II of Aragon and elements of the French nobility, this rebellion threatened to tear Castile apart. Sancho responded with force. Battles erupted across the countryside. Fortresses were besieged. Diplomats worked tirelessly to prevent neighboring kingdoms from intervening directly. Throughout these years, the king pushed himself beyond reason, leading troops through harsh winters and long campaigns without giving his body time to recover. By the early 1280s, Europe's political landscape shifted dramatically. The Reconquista intensified, with Christian kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula renewing their push against Muslim emirates in the south. Sancho, eager to secure his legacy and unify the realm through military victory, launched campaigns into Andalusian territories. These campaigns exposed him to disease, harsh climates, and exhaustion. According to medieval accounts, it may have been during a southern campaign that Sancho first experienced the circulation problems and fevers that would later destroy him. Modern historians analyzing the descriptions recorded by monks and royal scribes suggest he may have been suffering from a vascular disease, uncontrolled diabetes, or an infection caused by an untreated wound. In an age without antiseptics or antibiotics, even a small injury sustained on a battlefield could become fatal. Whatever the cause, by the winter of 1285-1286, symptoms had begun appearing with unmistakable severity. But Sancho refused to stop ruling. Every morning he held councils with his ministers. Every afternoon he read reports from the front lines. At night he met secretly with Maria to discuss threats from Aragon, Portugal, and the nobles aligned with the de la Cerda family. His drive to maintain control became almost obsessive, reinforcing his belief that stepping away from his duties would invite rebellion. In many ways, he was correct. Without his firm leadership, internal enemies would have seen their chance. While the king fought his physical decline, the court around him became a nest of tension. Nobles who had once supported him began questioning whether the kingdom could survive a monarch whose illness was clearly worsening. The smell coming from the royal chambers could no longer be ignored. Rumors circulated that the king was cursed or paying for the sins of rebellion against his father. Superstition played a central role in medieval life, and many saw Sancho's condition not as medical but divine punishment. In private, Maria tried to manage the situation with dignity. She rotated attendants so that fewer people witnessed the king's condition. She banned unauthorized access to the royal apartments. She silenced gossip through diplomatic pressure. Still, the reality of the king's illness could not be entirely hidden. Foreign ambassadors reported that Sancho's decline was accelerating. The Pope received letters expressing concern over the future of Castile. And in Aragon, the young Alfonso de la Cerda began preparing for the possibility that his long-awaited chance to claim the throne might finally be approaching. By 1287, Sancho could no longer travel to command his armies directly. His generals fought in his name, but the absence of the king on the battlefield shook morale. Many feared that without his leadership, the kingdom's enemies would strike. Maria responded by presenting herself publicly with confidence and grace, assuring the court that the king remained strong. Yet privately, she faced a terrifying truth. Time was running out. As the disease spread, Sancho's limbs swelled, darkened, and began to emit an unbearable odor. Medieval physicians, lacking the knowledge to diagnose or treat infection, resorted to desperate remedies. They burned herbs to purify the air, applied hot irons to the affected areas, and administered potions meant to draw out corruption. None of it worked. Every treatment only seemed to increase the king's suffering. The psychological toll on Sancho was immense. He understood fully what was happening to him. Chroniclers describe moments of clarity where he spoke candidly about his fear of leaving Castile vulnerable. He asked Maria to protect their son Ferdinand. He summoned loyal nobles and extracted oaths of allegiance. Even in agony, he thought of the kingdom first. It was during this period that the political instability worsened. Seeing the king weakened, rival nobles launched renewed rebellions. Some sought to carve out independent territories. Others plotted to kidnap Ferdinand or negotiate with Aragon. Maria found herself fighting two wars at once, one against the nobles threatening the state, and the other against the disease consuming her husband. Despite the turmoil, Sancho managed to secure temporary peace with certain factions. His final political achievements, including treaties with Granada and Portugal, helped stabilize the southern and western borders. But these victories came at the price of his remaining strength. By 1288, he was bedridden, unable to lift himself without assistance. His body continued to deteriorate, yet his mind remained sharp, a cruel irony that ensured he felt every moment of the suffering he endured. Sancho's deterioration coincided with the most dangerous moment of his reign. The nobles aligned with the de la Cerda claim waited like wolves for the moment he finally succumbed. Castile, exhausted by war and political turmoil, braced for chaos. The king's condition became so severe that monks prayed continuously outside his chambers. The smell of decay seeped into the halls. Physicians warned that death was imminent, and yet Sancho clung to life, determined to secure the succession for his son before it was too late. His final months were defined by fear, political maneuvering, and agony, setting the stage for a dramatic death that would shake the entire Iberian Peninsula. By the closing months of 1288, the royal palace of Valladolid had transformed from a center of political authority into a fortress of dread. Every corridor carried an unspoken terror. Every chamber echoed with the quiet panic of nobles who understood all too well what it meant for a king to die while the kingdom stood divided. But what horrified them even more was not that King Sancho Roman IV was dying. It was the manner in which he was dying. The King of Castile, called Sancho the Brave, the conqueror of rebels, the hammer of noble uprisings, was literally rotting alive. By this stage, the king's condition was impossible to conceal. The smell that drifted from his chambers seeped into the tapestries and wooden beams of the palace. Servants had to burn coals mixed with rosemary, lavender, and incense simply to make the room tolerable. His physicians tried cleansing his wounds with wine and hot oils, hoping to slow the decay, but nothing worked. They had no explanation for why the flesh seemed to die faster than Sancho's body could fight. They spoke in fearful whispers of corruption of the blood, of bad humors, or of a plague sent by God. But the monks who tended to the king saw something far more frightening. They recorded that the rot began in the lower legs, spreading upward over months until his thighs, hips, and abdomen showed signs of necrosis. His skin turned purple, then black, and the tissue beneath softened, giving off a sickening odor that made even hardened warriors flinch. His attendants changed his bedding constantly, but even fresh cloth could not contain the decay. In some accounts, worms were said to emerge from the wounds, though whether this was literal or a poetic expression of horror remains debated among historians. What is certain is that the decomposition was active, advancing, and unstoppable, and through it all Sancho remained conscious. His mind, tragically intact, ensured he experienced every wave of pain and every humiliation that came from a body failing in such a grotesque manner. Medieval kings were meant to die in dignity, surrounded by symbols of divine authority, but Sancho's death was stripping him of the very image of royalty. Despite his agony, he continued to rule. He met with council members from his bed. He issued orders through scribes. He attempted to arbitrate disputes among nobles rising against him, but it was clear to everyone that his power was slipping with each passing day. Every moment that he spent drifting in and out of fever gave his enemies time to act. The factions supporting the de la Cerda claim grew bold. In Aragon, the de la Cerda princes, now in their teens, trained for the possibility of war. In France, whispers circulated that Castile would soon be without a king. Even within the palace itself, some nobles believed that the king's suffering was a sign that God rejected him for rebelling against his father. In a time when divine judgment shaped political reality, such beliefs were dangerous. To counter these threats, Queen María de Molina stepped into a role no queen before her had ever held. She became the political guardian of Castile while her husband's body failed. It was she who negotiated truces with rebellious nobles. She who reassured the clergy that the throne would remain secure. She who met ambassadors in secret to project stability. And she who spent her nights in prayer, pleading not only for Sancho's life, but for the future of their children. Sancho, bedridden and surrounded by decay, relied heavily on Maria. In their private conversations he confessed his fears. He worried that his son Ferdinand, a child of barely 9 years, would never survive the political storms approaching. He feared that nobles would reject Maria's guardianship because she was a woman. He feared that the de la Cerda claim, long suppressed, would erupt with renewed force the moment he died. These fears were not unfounded. Reports reached the palace that rebellious lords in the region of Leon were mustering troops. Messages from Portugal hinted that King Denis might intervene if Castile appeared weak, and from Granada came word that Muslim rulers saw an opportunity to reclaim lost fortresses along the frontier. As his condition grew worse, Sancho attempted to consolidate loyalty. He granted lands, pardoned old enemies, and offered positions of power in exchange for oaths of allegiance to his son. But desperation weakened his authority. Some nobles accepted his promises only to betray him days later. Others refused entirely, believing that the throne would soon belong to another. Meanwhile, the royal physicians exhausted their knowledge. They attempted to drain what they believed were pockets of corrupted blood, but the bleeding left Sancho weaker and did nothing to slow the necrosis. They applied ointments of honey, vinegar, and herbs, hoping to cleanse the wounds, but the rot only spread faster. They even consulted wandering healers known for unusual remedies, but their potions offered no help. Throughout this period, chroniclers describe the king's struggle not only against the disease, but against despair. Some nights he raged, demanding more remedies. Other nights he fell into quiet resignation, whispering prayers as Maria held his hand. His attendants noted that he sometimes clutched at the sheets, as if trying to anchor himself to life through sheer force of will. One of the most disturbing elements of Sancho's final illness was how his condition transformed the atmosphere within the palace. Attendants rotated constantly, not only due to the smell, but due to fear. In medieval Europe, disease and the supernatural were intertwined. Some servants believed the rot was a curse. Others believed it was the devil's work. A few even claimed to hear whispers from the king's chambers when no one was inside, though these were likely tales born from anxiety. By early 1289, there was no longer any doubt that Sancho was dying. The physicians could not stop the infection. His body was losing mass rapidly. His speech became slurred as fever took hold. Yet he remained lucid enough to understand what was happening to his kingdom. He begged Maria to ensure Ferdinand's succession. He called knights to his bedside and demanded they swear on relics that they would serve the boy faithfully. He dictated final instructions regarding alliances with Portugal and Granada. These efforts were crucial. Without them, the kingdom might have shattered at the moment of his death, and that moment was approaching quickly. The final weeks of his life were filled with both horror and urgency. His wounds began to open, exposing muscle beneath the decaying skin. The infection had reached his torso, and the pain was unbearable. The palace guards wept when they were ordered to stand outside his door, because even through the heavy wood they could hear cries that no man, not even a king, should have to endure. Inside the room, Maria refused to leave his side. She kept the windows open to dispel the odor and prayed constantly. Monks recited scripture day and night. The candlelight flickered across the dying king's face, illuminating a man who had fought wars, subdued rebellions, and defied his father, but who now could not defy death. On the night of his death, the palace fell silent. Chroniclers describe a stillness so absolute that even the usually restless servants paused their work. Those closest to the king gathered in the chamber, aware that the moment had come. Sancho, barely able to speak, whispered instructions to Maria. He asked her to protect Ferdinand. He asked her to trust no one, not even those who seemed loyal. He asked her to use her wisdom to guide Castile through the storm that was coming. And then, with a final breath labored by fever and decay, the king died. But his death did not bring peace. It brought chaos. When word of his passing spread through the palace, the nobles erupted into competing factions. Some argued that the crown should pass to Alfonso de la Cerda. Others insisted that Ferdinand, though a child, was the rightful heir. Ambassadors sent secret messages to their kings. Rival claimants prepared armies. And at the center of it all stood a woman now widowed, exhausted, and mourning the horror she had witnessed. A queen who understood that her greatest test was only just beginning. Sancho Roman IV had died rotting alive. Now it was Castile's turn to face what remained. When King Sancho Roman IV's tortured body finally surrendered to death in April 1295, the halls of Valladolid did not echo with mourning hymns or quiet reverence. Instead, they erupted into panic. His death, horrifying enough on its own, was merely the opening blow in a political storm that threatened to tear Castile into pieces. The nobles who had watched the king decay now rushed to secure their own positions. Foreign powers, long waiting for this moment, began pushing their claims, and inside the palace, the only barrier between the kingdom and complete collapse was a woman still in grieving clothes, Queen María de Molina. The queen had barely slept during her husband's final weeks. She had watched Sancho rot away, fighting off not only infection and agony but fear for their son's future. When he died, the responsibility for what remained of Castile fell entirely on her shoulders. The moment the king's body was prepared for burial, the queen withdrew to pray, but she had no time for extended mourning. With the crown now on the head of a child barely 9 years old, Maria understood that every hour counted. Medieval thrones built on weak foundations rarely survived transition. Sancho's illness had weakened the monarchy long before his death, and now the vultures were descending. The most prominent challenger was Alfonso de la Cerda. Sancho's nephew and the son of the brother Sancho had bypassed in the succession. Alfonso, raised partly in France and protected by Aragon, had long awaited this moment. Many nobles believed his claim was morally superior and legally stronger. The French crown supported him. Aragon supported him. Several Castilian families, resentful of Sancho's decisions, rallied behind him the moment Sancho's death was announced. If Maria made a single mistake, the entire kingdom could fall into civil war. To protect her son, Prince Ferdinand, from becoming a pawn in the hands of these factions, she acted with speed and precision. She arranged for Ferdinand to be immediately acclaimed king by the loyal nobles present in Valladolid. The boy, terrified and newly fatherless, knelt beside his mother as the ceremony took place. But a declaration within the palace walls meant nothing unless the powerful families of Castile accepted it, and many did not. Within days, news spread of nobles rejecting Ferdinand's claim. The influential Lara family began gathering supporters for Alfonso de la Cerda. In the north, several lords declared they would not obey a child king. In Aragon, King James Roman II announced that Alfonso had the rightful claim and began preparing to intervene. France hinted that it too might support an invasion. And all the while, the Muslim emirates in the south watched with interest. A divided Castile was an opportunity to reclaim land lost during the Reconquista. If the kingdom erupted into chaos, it could lose decades of progress. Maria understood all of this better than anyone. Her experience as queen had taught her how volatile the nobles were, how quickly alliances shifted, and how dangerous old grudges could become. She had spent years helping Sancho hold the kingdom together. Now she had to do it alone. Her first challenge was securing the church's approval. Because her marriage to Sancho had been considered irregular due to distant blood relation, her children's legitimacy had long been questioned. Critics insisted that Ferdinand could not inherit a crown he had no right to hold. Maria moved swiftly. She sent envoys to negotiate with the papacy, pleading for official recognition of her marriage and her son's legitimacy. Letters, gifts, and promises of future cooperation were sent to Rome, but the response would take time, and Castile did not have time. As she waited, Maria embarked on a campaign of persuasion across the kingdom. She met with nobles personally, reminding them of their oaths to Sancho. She promised titles, lands, and favorable terms to those who pledged loyalty to Ferdinand. She courted the military orders, especially the Order of Santiago and the Order of Calatrava, knowing their support would be crucial. She even negotiated with former rebels, offering pardons in exchange for allegiance. Still, her enemies were equally active. The Lara family captured key strongholds in the north. Supporters of Alfonso de la Cerda raised armies and sought alliances with Aragon. In several regions, the nobles began acting independently of royal authority. Some declared themselves guardians of the throne, claiming Maria could not rule alone. Others sought to seize Ferdinand and declare themselves his protectors, knowing that whoever controlled the boy controlled the crown. Throughout this turmoil, Maria kept her son close. Despite the grief of losing his father and the fear of what lay ahead, Ferdinand trusted his mother's judgment completely. Chroniclers describe him as a quiet, observant child who understood the weight of the crown, but relied entirely on Maria's strength. At night, Maria prayed at his bedside, asking God for the wisdom and resolve needed to save Castile. Her greatest challenge came from Aragon. King James Roman, too, saw an opportunity to expand his influence and assert the de la Cerda claim. He invaded several border regions and supported rebellions in Castile. Maria's response was bold. She negotiated directly with Granada, Castile's traditional enemy, forming an unlikely but strategic alliance. By securing Muslim support against Christian Aragonese aggression, she ensured that Castile would not be overwhelmed on multiple fronts. This decision shocked much of Europe, yet it proved her political brilliance. With Granada's help, she repelled Aragonese advances and kept the frontier intact. Meanwhile, she continued negotiating with Castilian nobles, slowly rebuilding a coalition of support for Ferdinand. But the threats were constant. Assassination attempts against Maria were rumored. Plots to kidnap Ferdinand were uncovered. Regions like Galicia and Leon flirted with rebellion, and all this took place while Sancho's death still haunted the kingdom. His burial, delayed by the need to protect the body from rapid decomposition, became a symbol of instability. The people whispered that the king had died cursed. Some believed the rot in his body was a sign from heaven that Castile would soon rot as well. Yet Maria refused to let the kingdom fall. Her most remarkable victory came not on the battlefield, but through diplomacy. In a moment of desperation, she met in secret with nobles who had long opposed her husband. She appealed not to their loyalty, but to their self-interest. She argued that a civil war would devastate their lands and leave them vulnerable to Aragon and Granada. She pointed out that Alfonso de la Cerda, raised in foreign courts, would favor French and Aragonese influence. Ferdinand, she insisted, was Castilian-born and Castilian-raised. Slowly, grudgingly, nobles returned to the fold. By 1296, Castile was still precarious, but it had not collapsed. Battles continued. Rebellions flared. Alfonso de la Cerda still claimed the throne, but Maria was winning, and the church finally issued its ruling. Her marriage to Sancho was valid, and her children legitimate. This changed everything. With the church's authority behind her, Maria forced rebellious nobles to submit. She secured treaties with Portugal and Granada. Aragon withdrew from direct conflict. Support for Alfonso de la Cerda began to crumble. Although the conflict would continue intermittently for years, the worst danger had passed. Ferdinand Roman IV inherited a kingdom scarred but saved, and he ruled because his mother fought for him with a determination unmatched by any ruler of the age. Sancho Roman IV's horrific death, a tragedy that stripped him of dignity, had nearly dragged Castile into destruction. Instead, it forged a queen who became one of the most capable political leaders in medieval European history. Maria de Molina stabilized the kingdom, protected her son, and ensured the continuation of the Castilian monarchy. Without her, the history of Spain would have taken a different path. The kingdoms of Castile and Leon might have fractured permanently. Aragon and France might have gained dominance over the Iberian Peninsula, and the Reconquista might have stalled, reshaping the future of Europe. Sancho's death was remembered as a tale of physical horror, but the true legacy of his final years was the resilience of the queen who refused to let his suffering define the fate of their kingdom. Maria carried Castile through the storm. She became the guardian of the monarchy, the architect of stability, and the force that allowed future rulers to unify Spain. And thus, the story of the king who rotted alive became not only a tale of death, but a story of survival, political brilliance, and the endurance of a kingdom that nearly fell with him.